Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a moment. So, thank you for tuning in and being here. Okay. Hopefully, you have the source sheet available. Of course, I will be sharing it on the screen, but maybe as we're waiting for people to come in, most people are already here, but we'll wait another minute or so. I'd love for you just to put in the chat what your plans are for your virtual Rosh Hashanah. What are you going to be doing to mark Rosh Hashanah? Are you going to be watching services? Are you going to do it exactly when they go live? Or have you set a time as a family or in your household to determine a specific time you're going to watch? How are you approaching this holiday starting tomorrow night and then on the day of? What's your plan? How are you going to mark this occasion in this new space? I'm just curious because we've been talking about it as our own family. I mean, for me, the fact that I'm going to be home for Rosh Hashanah dinner and that I get to actually cook some of it and then get to sit with my family, that's a first. So I'm looking forward to that. Those who have been in this line of business, so to speak, a lot longer than I have, this is the first time, I know for Rabbi Leader, he mentioned today in our clergy meeting, first time in 30-something years that he's home with his family for dinner. So I'm lucky that I've only been in this business for, I don't even know how many years at this point, but not as many as that. So I feel like I'm lucky that at this point in my career I have that opportunity. And at the same time, I was just talking to Don Levy, who's behind the scenes here helping us as he does every week, and who's in charge of our communications. And he and I were talking about how even for him, it's a weird time, and having to try and shift our perspective on what it means to celebrate these holidays when we are so used to a certain routine. It's pretty amazing how we've gotten used to a ritualized routine, not just of the services themselves, but how we approach those services. What does it mean to pull into that parking lot? Do you always park in the same place? Do you get there at the same time? Do you sit in the same seats? You see the same people? What does it mean for us to have to shift into a different mindset where we're not going to have those cues for our ritual this year? And yet we want to hold on to the special nature of this day. So how we're doing that. So please feel free to share. I see a couple. David says watching services from home per normal schedule, and then family Zoom for Rosh Hashanah and your birthday. Well, what an amazing birthday, right? The birthday of the world and your birthday. So happy early birthday to David Greenside. Jeff has said, I already made my chicken soup for tomorrow and an apple pie. Perfect. Phyllis says, we're planning a lovely dinner and then we'll watch services live. Looking forward to that. And Merle says, services live with our kids, dinner with the family. Same for Yom Kippur. Today, watching afternoon of Yom Kippur at home. All very strange. Yes, all very strange indeed. Okay. Well, I'll be very curious your insights next week for you to add to the chat what your Rosh Hashanah experience was like, and if you are shifting your approach for Yom Kippur based on your Rosh Hashanah experience, right? I'm so curious what it's going to be like for me as well. And we also filmed the second day Rosh Hashanah in a different style than our first day Rosh Hashanah services. Our first day Rosh Hashanah services are in the sanctuary. Our second day Rosh Hashanah services are outdoors in the outdoor area at our West Campus, and it has a different vibe. So I'm going to be curious what it even means, and those who decide to check out services from different communities. What does it mean to compare and contrast services, and what does it mean as an outsider if you're looking at services from another community that's not your own? What insights can you gather from that? The whole thing is fascinating. All right, but let's get to some Talmud. Just a couple quick announcements about Talmud. As I alluded to last week, we are not, unfortunately, going through this class forever. as much as I'd like to. We have about 3 weeks left after this. So October 8th, you can mark your calendar that October 8th will be our last session together for Talmud Tales. And I am going to start thinking about what it means for us to conclude this class, because many who tune in have been tuning in every week, or at least as often as they could. So I'd like for us to figure out some kind of way to have a siyum of some sorts. A siyum is really at the culmination, whether you finish a tractate of Talmud and you finish a piece of Talmud, or you've gone through a process of learning something together with your chavruta or with a group of fellow students. There's usually some kind of celebration to mark the end of that time. So I'd like to mark that in some way. So if you have any ideas on what it would mean in this platform to mark the end of our, by that point I think it's going to be 29 sessions together studying Talmud, feel free to put it in the chat as well, any ideas you have, and I'll take those into consideration as I think about how we could best conclude our time together in a few weeks. So there will be other classes, as Merle asks. Yes, and just at Clergy Today, we started talking about what some of those classes are going to be, and so we're still working out the details. I think within the next 2 weeks, definitely by the time this set of classes ends on that week of Sukkot, we'll have the lineup ready to share with all of you for the new classes that will start then the week or two later. Okay, so getting into Talmud, as you know, the Zoom protocol, you can raise your hand, we'll go through it, I'll read through it, we'll interpret it a little, and then, of course, your interpretations and your thoughts, of course. So let's first begin with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. All right. For those who tuned in to Slichot last weekend, it was a beautiful, I thought it was a beautiful production, and really a lot of praise for Tess Cutler, who was our editor. Excuse me. We partnered with 3 other synagogues, but we were responsible for editing and putting it together. So Don Levy, who was behind the scenes, along with Tess Cutler and Cantor Lisa Peacock, really did the bulk of the work to bring it all together. It was really nice for us to partner with those other communities and to have that collaboration. So I talked in a learning session, I taught one of the passages that we actually studied a long time ago, and I taught it again, and I wanted to build off on that concept again this week, this idea of ugliness. It was the story of the ugly man, for those who didn't have a chance to tune in. And so I thought we could look at another story along the same vein this week, because really as we're approaching Rosh Hashanah tomorrow night, we are supposed to be moving purely internally. We're supposed to start to forego the importance that we place on the exterior, and we are supposed to move to the interior of the human experience and of our emotions and our spirit. And so often we get caught in the physical and in the outward. So I want to look at another story that takes a different lens to this idea of ugliness and outward versus inward. So that's what we're going to look at today. In addition to this idea of the outward versus inward, I think it continues to expand the definition of ugliness beyond just the physical. And in this case, different from the ugly man story, I think this one looks at ugliness as a way of understanding our own human experience throughout our lives. There are those moments of beauty, and there are those moments of ugliness. You know, just think about your own life and those moments of tragedy or loss or sadness or sickness. So many moments of ugliness. And I think there is a layer here that we should be reading this story, not just a teaching about the physical appearance of outward versus what it means to be looking inward at someone, but also how do we look at it and at the expanse of our lives. And Rosh Hashanah and the high holidays is a time for us to be thinking about where are we on that timeline of our life, and not necessarily the timeline of what it means to be closer to death, but what does it mean to really understand how we are living our lives? Are we getting further along in our timeline of what it means to accomplish our goals? Are you getting closer? And can you make sure that this new year is an opportunity to get a little closer? Okay, so with that, let's look at the story. Okay. Of course, don't have the story up here. Yes, I do. Okay, here we go. Session 26, the vessel from Ta'anit. We have studied passages from Ta'anit before. And so remember, this is the section of the Talmud that deals with droughts and special prayers and opportunities and fast days to deal with droughts. So lots of great material here. And so let's read through it. Said Rabbi Chanina bar Ida, why are words of Torah compared to water? As it is written, lo, everyone who thirsts, come for water. It is to say to you, just as water leaves a higher spot and flows to a lower spot, so words of Torah endure only for him who is humble. Excuse me. Sorry for 1 second. So words of Torah endure only for him who is humble in his knowledge. Said Rabbi Oshaya, why are words of Torah compared to these three liquids, water, wine, and milk, in line with the verses, lo, everyone who thirsts, come for water. Come buy and eat, yes, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. It is to say to you, just as these three liquids last only when kept in the least costly jugs, clay ones that, not silver, so words of Torah endure only for him who is humble in his knowledge. That is in line with what the daughter of Caesar said to Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah. Said Caesar's daughter to Rabbi Yoshua, beautiful Torah in an ugly vessel. He said to her, learn from your father's household. In what do they store wine? She said to him, in clay utensils. He said to her, well, everybody stores wine in clay utensils, and you store wine in clay utensils too. You who are nobles should keep it in vessels of gold and silver. She went and told this to her father, and he stored wine in gold and silver utensils, and it turned sour. They went and told him. He said to his daughter, who told you this? She said to him, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. They summoned him. He said to him, why did you say this to her? He said to him, because this is what she said to me, so I answered her in the same way. But lo, aren't there good-looking men who study? If they were ugly, they would learn still more. Another matter, just as these three liquids spoil only through neglect, so words of Torah are forgotten only through neglect. Okay. So we're going to go back through this. I included pieces that came just before the story about Caesar's daughter, just to give you a little bit of framework to what's being talked about. They're going through here a list of things of comparing Torah to different liquids and a variety of different things. And so in this case, they start with this idea of water and then move into milk and wine and water, and then we get the story. So all of this is in the framework of how do you understand the Torah, how do you understand the Jewish people and what they can be compared to. And so here we have that is the frame. And then we have Caesar's daughter, we have this rabbi, and we have this exchange about wine and the fact that it was kept in clay containers. And then the rabbi suggests that it should be maybe, since they are wealthy, they should keep it in something that is in line with their lifestyle. And as a result of that, it doesn't turn out so well. And then we have the teaching at the very end. Okay, so let's go back, and I want you to try and think about what are the lessons here about ugliness? What is this trying to teach us about how we are supposed to engage with other people, not just about ugliness, but what's going on here? Do you agree with the rabbi's approach to how he's teaching this woman a lesson? And anything else you may be thinking of. So let's go back to it and go through it one more time, and then, of course, we'll open it up for your thoughts. Okay, so it begins why are words of Torah compared to water? Like I said, this is in the context of comparing Torah and the Jewish people to a variety of things, and says, so this verse from Isaiah, everyone who thirsts, come for water. So it is to say, just as water leaves a higher spot and flows to a lower spot, so words of Torah endure only for him who is humble in his knowledge. Okay, so this is going to come back. This theme of humility is something that also comes out in the story itself. But here, this idea of humility, of those who don't hold themselves up on high, but who recognize that they are supposed to be vessels that catch and gather together the water of Torah and the sustenance of Torah, not to necessarily try to be the teacher all the time or the one who is giving out information. Or if we think about Moses and the rock and the idea of him hitting the rock so that the water would come forth. Instead, what it means for us to just take in knowledge from the world and not try and force it necessarily, but the idea that it will flow to us. And can we have faith in this idea that we are constantly learning, and to be okay with that and to be open to the amount of water, aka learning, that is just flowing over us, even when we're in our homes, right? No matter where we are, we have that opportunity to just be sustained and to have our thirst quenched with knowledge. And that is something that we need to be constantly doing. We should be reading, we should be writing, we should be doing as much as we can so that we can take in as much sustenance as possible. Okay, so then we go to Rabbi Wilshire, who says, why are words of Torah compared to the three liquids, water, wine, and milk? In line with the verses, one of which we just read from Isaiah, lo, everyone who thirsts, come for water. And the second one, come buy and eat, yes, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. So a passage from Jeremiah, which mentions both wine and milk. So therefore, putting all these three things together, why would Torah be compared to these three liquids, right? You would imagine maybe it would be compared just to milk. You think about milk and honey, that the land of Israel is the land of milk and honey. But here there are three liquids. So the rabbis want to know, this rabbi wants to know why these three. It is to say, just as these three liquids last only when kept in the least costly jugs, clay ones, but not silver, so words of Torah endure only for him who is humble in his knowledge. Again, we have this theme of humility. And here we have this idea that it's only when they are kept in the least costly, in the things that don't look so nice, that actually are not expensive, that they do the best, right? So what's the teaching there? So how are we supposed to understand this about our own lives? And so therefore, there is a story that comes to illustrate that. And this is the story. The story is of the daughter of Caesar, who is talking to a rabbi, one of the famous rabbis. Clearly, she is not Jewish, and clearly she is of high status in the community. Said Caesar's daughter to Rabbi Yehoshua, beautiful Torah in an ugly vessel. In other words, great, you're a wonderful teacher, but you are really ugly. You are not a good-looking person, and yet your Torah is incredible, and you're an amazing teacher, but the Torah doesn't seem to match how you look. And she seems to be suggesting that this is a negative thing. This is not a positive characteristic. And also a sense of confusion as to how is it possible that the outside and the inside don't match? And is it possible for an outside and the inside not to match in a positive way? In other words, for your outward appearance to be so negatively, you just don't want to look at this person, and yet they bring such Torah to life. Now, on the surface, I think we can all agree that, yes, of course, you can't just judge a book by its cover, so to speak, or just look at someone's outside appearance and understand who they are. But I don't think the rabbis are suggesting that we are so simplistic that they have to teach that lesson to us. So what is the deeper lesson here that is being taught to us if it's not just don't judge a book by its cover, or don't just see the outside as the same as the inside, and vice versa? So maybe you can help me understand what you think that deeper lesson is. He said to her, learn from your father's household. And what do they store wine? So now we have, as a good teacher, he's asking questions. He's not even answering necessarily with a statement. One of the things he's doing is trying to teach through asking questions. We've talked about questions in this class before, the power of questions, the importance in our tradition of asking questions. And here we have, I think, a lesson in terms of how can we respond when someone says something to us that is really offensive. Can we respond in a way by guiding them by asking them a question to truly really understand what's going on in this case? And here he does it brilliantly by now talking about wine. And she says her father, Caesar, does it in clay utensils. Okay, well, everybody, he says, stores wine in clay utensils, and you store wine in clay utensils too. You're going about storing wine like every single other person. But you who are noble should keep it in vessels of gold and silver. So why are you trying to pretend to be like everyone else, so to speak? He seems to be suggesting you should have the outside appearance of the way in which you store wine match the wine that is inside, and it is, of course, probably the best wine that you can find in the land, and therefore you should store it in gold and silver. And so she went and she told this to her father, and he decided to store his wine in gold and silver utensils, and it turned sour, which actually is scientifically accurate because there are acids that exist in wines that when they are kept in contact with certain metals, that they turn more acidic and can sour the wine, and sometimes can actually turn to become poisonous. So this is scientifically accurate. They went and told him, in other words, now Caesar's people went and told him, and he said to his daughter, who told you this? Why would you have us change the way we're keeping our wine to gold and silver? Who would do that? And she said, the rabbi. So they summon the rabbi in, and he says, well, the Caesar says to the rabbi, why did you say this to her? And so the rabbi says, well, because this is what she said to me, so I answered her in the same way. In other words, she said, your outer appearance doesn't match your capabilities internally and intellectually. And so I answered her the same way. You take something that when it's inside is supposed to bring joy or sweetness or comfort, and on the outside, well, a clay pot or a clay place to store it is, of course, boring and ugly. So therefore, why are you doing that? And so, lo, aren't there good-looking men who study? In other words, well, Rabbi, does everyone have to be ugly in order to be a good teacher of Torah? And this is an interesting answer. If they were ugly, they would learn still more. So he's not denying the fact that there are some people who are good-looking who are Torah scholars, but he's suggesting, no, if they are ugly, they would be better teachers. That's what makes a good teacher, according to this text. That's the interesting twist that's coming at the end here. And what does that mean? What does it mean that the ugly people are the ones who actually can be better teachers of Torah? I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. So another matter, just as these three liquids that we talked about in the very beginning, the milk and the wine and the water, spoil only through neglect, so words of Torah are forgotten only through neglect. So they kind of shift it to one other little teaching that's slightly related, but not completely exactly related to the story we just read, which is the idea that when you neglect these things, in other words, if you keep them in something that is not the proper storage container for them, or if you don't care for them, then they go sour. And similarly to Torah, if we don't use Torah in our lives, if we are not living by it, if we're not constantly learning what it means to live a life of meaning and value from our tradition, then we are neglecting it and it will go sour. And I don't think it means here just go sour for us in the sense that we will forget Torah or we're not going to be able to live as fully by its messages, but that maybe we have the power, unfortunate power, to impact the necessity of Torah altogether. That if we as a collective were to neglect Torah, if we weren't going to prioritize the importance of continuing to learn, of education, of reminding ourselves about the messages of our tradition, if we neglect that, and if we don't have those conversations, or if we just keep it in our own vessel, if we are a vessel, and we are supposed to be a vessel of God, if we are only keeping our learning to ourselves and being selfish, so to speak, by not sharing the learning that we have gained from life and from our own intellectual journeys, if we're not sharing that with other people, not only are we neglecting our capability of making the world a better place, but we're also neglecting the impact of Torah and diminishing Torah in the world. And that, of course, is against everything we want to do. So that's the piece about the liquid spoiling. I just want to go back one line to this idea. If they were ugly, they would learn still more. This is where I think the story is moving us away from just the physical to really what it means to look at our life experience. That you can't just say that someone's physical appearance, if they're ugly, makes them a better teacher. We could probably assume that people who have a less appealing physical appearance probably have different challenges than those who are not in that situation. However, here I really do think that it's talking about the ugliness of our lives, and that those who focus purely on just the beautiful moments and or the people who are blessed in an interesting way are either blessed, or you could see it as cursed, with only a very basic run-of-the-mill life, so to speak, that those people aren't as good teachers as those who have experienced the ugliness of the world. And those who have experienced the ugliness of the world are better teachers for the rest of us. And so here I think it's talking about the power of suffering, the power of loss, that if we can tap into that ugliness that we've experienced, not the ugliness that lies within each one of us, which I think is the ugly man story. This is different. This is about looking at ugliness in the ways in which, if you were to imagine your life up to this point, and those moments, of course, of beauty, but of course we've all had those moments of ugliness in our own lives as well. What have we learned from those moments of ugliness? And usually there are deep lessons about ourselves, about how we can make this world a different place through those ugly moments, even more so than the moments of beauty. And here I think this is what theologically what the rabbis are trying to key in on for us is, don't just focus on the beauty in your life. Find that there's actually the beauty in the suffering and in the pain and in the ugliness. And when you can tap into that, you can actually expand the beauty in the world around you through your ugliness. And that your ugliness is going to make you a better teacher of the world, and that you almost have a responsibility to be able to teach the Torah of your ugliness to others, and to not shy away from those moments. I just started reading a book that my friend wrote. He's a Christian pastor. He was, and now he's kind of more expansive than that. And this book is very personal, at least in the beginning. He's talking about his own challenges in his childhood. And up until recently was not a piece of what he would talk about on the road and in the big forums. He was on the road with Oprah for a while. And here he's really getting into some of the darkness and the ugliness of his early years of his life. And as I was sitting there reading it, because he just gave it to me yesterday, I was starting to see that other side of him that I had a piece of, because he had shared a little bit with me over time, but a piece that actually expanded his teaching. He's already an excellent teacher. But now to see this lens on top of everything else makes him, in my mind, an even better teacher. So I think it's a lesson here about we shouldn't shy away from those moments that we may think are going to be embarrassing, or we may think are just to be kept to ourselves, that if we can find a way in our lives to start to express that ugliness and to share some of that ugliness, that we can bring a whole beauty to those ugly moments. So that's a little bit for what I have from this text. Let me see if there's anything else. Also, this idea that wisdom is sometimes better suited in humble settings, that it's not from on high, but that the humility of what that means is that we also have a responsibility to learn not just from the scholars, but from everyone. And that if we can look to gain understanding from those who may not, on the surface, be the ones who are supposed to teach us something, then we may learn certain things that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. Okay, enough from me. Let's go to all of you. And Jeff, start us off, please.
Well, there are a couple of thoughts that I have about this. And one is in understanding the characteristics of liquid, water, milk, wine, they all assume the shape of the container they're put into. And all the vessels that we're talking about have to contain Torah, and yet It's interacting with the vessel itself. The vessel, as we would describe each of us being that vessel, we bring to that liquid that's put into us vis-a-vis Torah learning, the biases, the experiences that shape us and shape the quality of that teaching and our understanding of that liquid or teaching of Torah. And depending on your life, whether it's sweet, rich, poor, shapes you as that vessel for learning and for using that knowledge of Torah. And if you're so damaged that you can't appreciate the learning that the Torah or liquid being put into you can shape you with, that's the ugliness, unfortunately, that overcomes the goodness of the teaching. And the vessels, we are all that vessel, shaped by experience, shaped by bias, shaped by love, shaped by hatred. And all of that Torah has to fit in somewhere and shape that behavior and mold you as a person. So don't be that ugly person if you can avoid it, yet the ugly person needs to accept as much Torah as they can to not remain that ugly person.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. As always, really appreciate your insights. Based on what you're saying, I think there's a challenging piece here that also suggests that if your outside appearance, and in this case, I want to take it not just to the physical, but to our life experience. If your life experience is one of mostly success, then actually you're more damaged than if you have had challenges in your life. And I'm curious what people think about that because most of the time we seem to be trying to get people to see success. And yes, we when we're educating our children, we teach them the importance of failure. But we also then look at to success as the model. And yet, by doing so, we're almost forgetting the fact that most of what we learn and how we gain that success is through the ugliness that we experience. Tom. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you. Just picking up on the thought you just uttered, I think it's a pretty common understanding that we actually learn more from our failures than from our success. It's just failures are a pretty good teacher in terms of trying to correct it going forward. And you were talking about ugliness, and I kind of almost look at it a little differently. I find that when you're listening to somebody, whether it's a teacher or an associate, if they're actually a little more vulnerable, if they're willing to open themselves up a bit and show you warts and all, they tend to come across as more authentic. And I think that you tend to listen a little harder. You may even tend to identify, well, nobody's perfect. So it's nice this person had the courage and the strength to make themselves vulnerable or ugly. And I can learn from this person. Another thought I had is when you were talking at the beginning or read from the beginning about the water starting at a higher spot and then a lower spot. What occurred to me is that when you initially read Torah, you're reading words. And it isn't until you think deeply about those words and you start to internalize both the words and at least the meanings to you of what those words have, that you may be able to discern a higher learning, if you will. So on the one hand, it's a bit superficial, but the deeper or lower you go, the more inculcated those words become and allow you to think about it. You move from almost the materialistic to something that has much deeper meaning. And then lastly, the thought I had about vessels is that the more ornate a vessel is, whether it's a cup or a bottle of wine or a human being, the more the outside may detract from what exists on the inside. And it's the inside that often is the most valuable, if you will, where you can learn more, where you see the kind of person that you're talking to, that the vessel can sometimes detract and blind you from seeing the thoughtfulness, the humility, the learned that exists within the vessel. So actually, a vessel that does not detract from its contents allows you to explore the content more fully and perhaps more accurately. So there are a number of random thoughts there, but that's what these passages brought up for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I love all of those. And I think your third point is linked to your first point, which is the more we can match our outside appearance with being authentic of who we are and match that with our internals, it is more attractive. And we also then therefore get past the outside and go deeper into who this person is or what they're able to teach us. And on your second point, I really like this idea of, the Torah starts as words on a page and it moves to something different. And I would say what it's moving towards is how it becomes alive, right? If we think about the water flowing and water as life, and as in our own tradition, the symbol of life, the life-giving force, the fact that that water was there even before anything else was created in the world, that if we can understand that we can move Torah from words on a page to how we live our life and we live by them, that is how they sink down and go through our pores, our spiritual pores, our intellectual pores, into the heart of who we are. And our goal is to not just see them anymore as words on a page, but to live them. And almost so that they become suffused within us to the point where, like water in our own bodies, the fact that most of our body is water, it becomes part of who we are to the point where we can't survive without it, and not just survive without continuing to be accessing it from an external source, the Torah itself or the words on the page, but that our own nourishment, we get nourished by the Torah that we have internalized and made a part of who we are and how we identify ourselves, how we make decisions. That's the ultimate goal of Torah. That's the ultimate goal of these stories, is to figure out a way in which this moves out of the intellectual realm into just our being, into being a part of who we are. And I think that is the spiritual journey in many ways, is about coming to a place where you don't even have to articulate you're on a spiritual journey. It's just what you're doing. It is who you are. You can intellectualize it, but it really is just in the essence of who you are. So thank you very much, Tom. I really love those. Any other thoughts or comments on any of these pieces? Any pieces that either Jeff or Susan. Hi, Susan.
Have to unmute. Okay, I'm giving an alternative universe here.
Great.
I love that you related this to the internalization of and the ugliness being the looks of the rabbi. But I'm an art historian, retired, and I'm a very visual person. And I know that, and I saw this initially, which I was wrong, that she was saying a beautiful Torah in an ugly vessel. And how we also in Judaism try and beautify our environment. And the Torah is draped in beautiful colors. We've got the crowns that are there, and they're beautiful, and that's part of our experience of the world, and we honor Judaism and our religion and the Torah by beautifying the environment in which it's contained. So that's an alternative kind of view.
Great. I love that. Do you think that is in line with the story. It's are we supposed to learn something from the story about how we are supposed to beautify the world around us?
I mean, that could be part of it too. I liked being corrected in my initial view that it was an internal situation he was talking about, and that was the lesson that he taught about the silver utensils actually spoiling the liquid contents inside of it. But candlesticks. I just think that beautifying the accoutrements of our Jewish household gives them the kind of importance and stature. Candlesticks, for instance, maybe that are silver. That I bought some beautiful ceramic ones made in Israel, and that just adds a glow to it. If you can see, if you're a visual person as well, and there are ceremonial objects, the yad that are made to be good looking and like. Those aren't vessels though. So I get it from your interpretation, but I wouldn't discount beauty, and I wouldn't also discount looks, because even when someone is teaching, if they're too good looking, then as one of my teachers in junior high was, and you get taken away by that and can't concentrate.
Great.
If they're schleppy, you're thinking, they should really tuck in their pants when they're trying to just. So it's something visual. This was not the purpose of the story, but that's the way my mind went.
Great. And there is a commandment, thank you, Susan, that we are supposed to beautify the mitzvot, and we're supposed to beautify our experiences of fulfilling a mitzvah. That's why the Torah is dressed so beautifully. That's why you are supposed to make your Shabbat table look different than what the table looks like every other day of the week. So our tradition doesn't negate beauty and asceticism. There is something really important about that. Just like we aren't a people who frowns away from success or being successful financially. There's nothing wrong with those things. But so you're right. There is an element that we have to remember, that our tradition does see that you should sanctify. That one of the ways in which we sanctify our tradition and what we're doing is to make it as beautiful as possible. And you're right, they're not necessarily vessels. I guess you could see the Torah covers and what adorns the Torah as a vessel for the Torah itself. But you're right. That's where I would differentiate this being the vessel, where we're supposed to move beyond just the beautifying of what we're experiencing, and really about what's underneath that. But very good points. Thank you very much, Susan. Yes, Jeff, you have something else to say.
I was just taking the point of vessels, in a sense, one step further, in that they mentioned objects of silver and gold as vessels. And in essence, that could represent idolatry and the spoiling of the purity of the water in the Torah's lessons. That it's a warning against going to the extremes for hedonism and self-gratification, and using objects and things as your idol. And we're always warned about false idols everywhere in the Torah. And again, it's kind of an indirect reference to that. But again, the simplicity of Torah, the simplicity of water, the ability of water to shape us if we think in terms of the Torah's lessons, I think is a part of this, maybe a smaller part, but it has to do with the interaction of us as vessels with our motivations and how we look at things.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. Pamela wrote, I'm intrigued by the presence of Caesar's daughter in this and wonder how often Caesar and family are present in the Talmud. That's a good question. I don't know how often they are present. There are lots of times where non-Jews and either foreign dignitaries or foreign leaders or the wealthy, even we've looked at some stories about, in some cases, women who were not Jewish who served as sex symbols and physical symbols of beauty that were intriguing to the men and to the rabbis. So there are definitely outsiders who are present a lot in the Talmud, and that's because we've always been outsiders ourselves. And so the way in which we have seen the world as Jews has always been, how do we look at the majority if we are the minority, and not necessarily, in some points, how do we fit in, but other times, how do we distinguish ourselves and what distinguishes us? And that's a big piece of many of the rituals, going back to what Susan said. If you think about Havdalah, if you think about Friday night Kiddush and the Kiddush cup that we're supposed to hold up, those are about distinguishing and separating pieces of the week, but we do that a lot. We are people who like to separate, and not in a way of diminishing one over the other, but just differentiating between one and the other. So thank you for raising that question, Pamela. All right, well, that is going to do it for this week. Thank you very much. I want to wish all of you a Shana Tova Umetuka, a sweet and good new year. Definitely, I pray one of health for you and your loved ones and your friends and your community. May you be inspired in your own way, even in our isolation in these next coming days with Rosh Hashanah, that we can't gather together as a community. How can you strive for feeling a part of something bigger than yourself during this holiday? How can, as I mentioned last week, find a way to ritualize this moment and to differentiate this Rosh Hashanah, not only from past Rosh Hashanahs, but how can you differentiate it from the rest of the week? How can you set aside time? How can you maybe turn off your phone or turn off your email for a certain amount of time and really honor what our tradition is suggesting, which is, if you want to enter the new year and you want to leave some of this ugliness that we've been experiencing in this past year, and we want to get more into that beauty, number one, can we focus on the ugliness of this past year and the ways in which it has taught us lessons about how we can find more beauty in the world? And then how can we transform that into something in this coming year that can make the world around us even more beautiful? So wishing you all the best. Thank you again for joining me. As I mentioned, we have a few weeks left. We'll be ending on October 8th. That will be our final class. If you have any suggestions on what we should do to celebrate our last class together on the 8th, please feel free to email me. And look forward to seeing all of you and hearing your thoughts and feedback for our story next week in the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. All right, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone.